Welcome back. In the readings for this week, we see that a correspondence begins between Kathy and Linton as they grow older. This is a correspondence that Nellie disapproves of, but is helpless to stop, and one that Heathcliff is encouraging for his own purposes. We have another time jump that happens now. The two children are both teenagers, and they've both grown up isolated, remember, from the rest of the world. Kathy's isolation has been rather pleasant, while Linton's has apparently been miserable. But they do both have that upbringing of seclusion in common. So it's perhaps natural that since they're the only other young people that each of them knows, that they would fall in love. Or at least that they would imagine themselves to be in love with each other. This is another example of what Emily Bronte has been doing throughout the novel. She's taking the typical romantic tropes, we might even call them cliches, and presenting a more nuanced view of them. Because the story of two young lovers separated by feuding families definitely isn't new. In fact, I'm sure you're probably familiar with the most famous of these stories, Romeo and Juliet, William Shakespeare's play. And in that play, we have the two wealthy households, the Montagues and the Capulets, both alike in dignity, as Shakespeare says, and they are locked in this sort of multi-generational feud. And then we have the two young people who fall in love and are hindered from being together by the wanton cruelty of their prospective families. But what's happening here in Wuthering Heights is a similar story, but we're not seeing it from the perspective of the two young lovers. We're seeing it from the perspective of the older generation who's trying to keep them asunder, and actually has really good reasons for doing so. Nellie is doing her best to thwart the communications between Kathy and Linton, and it's kind of funny reading about this budding romance from her older, more measured, and in a sense more cynical perspective. She considers the whole affair to be complete childishness, complete foolishness. She calls their love letters that they're writing to each other trash. But more importantly, she also has good reasons for why Kathy should not be allowed to talk to Linton. We can imagine that Kathy probably sees her as this cruel, unfeeling matron who is stopping the course of true love. But we're seeing things through Nellie's perspective, and we understand that she has good reasons for doing what she's doing. Kathy isn't being kept away from the Heights out of wanton cruelty. She's being kept away because both Nellie and Edgar know that Heathcliff is a dangerous man, who wishes her nothing but ill will. In fact, Nellie suspects that the letters she's been receiving, supposedly from her friend Linton, are more likely from Heathcliff's hand than from his son's. So there's prudence in Nellie's objection to the romance. It's not just an unstated, unexplained grudge of the other family involved as it is in Romeo and Juliet. And Nellie does a good job of explaining her actions to Kathy so that she doesn't seem just like an enemy. You'll remember back when we were talking about Victor Frankenstein and how his father dismissed the philosophers that he was reading as trash. That I said then that a good mentor or a good parent should always be able to explain to their pupil or their child what the reasons are for saying don't do this or don't do that. They shouldn't just rely on their authority to carry all the weight and not answer any legitimate questions or concerns. So Nellie does the right thing here. But this time it isn't enough. Kathy is fairly warned about who Heathcliff is and about what sort of a character Linton is, but it still isn't enough to dissuade her from making visits to the Heights when she can. And let's talk about the dynamic of their relationship for a moment, because it reveals a lot about their individual personalities. We learn that Kathy is caring and selfless. We've already learned that to some extent because we see that she takes care of her father when he gets sick, and that she also takes care of Nellie when she gets sick. So she's a sort of a natural caretaker, and that makes her the best, or the worst, depending on how you look at it, sort of a person to be around Linton. because we'll see that he's the sort of person who demands to be taken care of. But we can't really say that she loves him in the way of a romantic partner, traditionally. She says it herself. She feels like he's her brother, and in fact, she wishes that he were her brother. She says a brother is better than a husband because sometimes husbands hate their wives, whereas a brother-sister relationship is more endearing. And there may be an echo here of the reasoning that we see in the Greek tragedian Sophocles' play Antigone. In that play, if you've read it, if you haven't, it's a good play. Check it out. The heroine of that play, Antigone, she makes the case that her duty to her brother by burying his dead body extends beyond her duty to any other family member were they in the same case. Because if it were a husband, she would always be able to find another one, but with both her parents dead, she would never have another brother again. So I don't know, there might be a tie-in there, whether it was intentional on Emily Bronte's part or not, I'm not sure, but there is something special she's pointing out between this, or about this brother-sister bond. So although she cares for Linton, it's not like she's smitten with him, as Isabella was for Heathcliff. She's not even generally fond of him, as we might expect in a normal relationship. She tells Nellie that really every time she goes to be with him, she's miserable. But with Linton, it's his sheer pathetic personality that brings out this selfless, caring side of Cathy, and makes her feel that she's obligated to be around him and to nurse him. And like I said earlier, Linton is the sort of person to take full advantage of this. We come to find out that he's this self-pitying tyrant. He's been sickly all of his life, and he's learned how to use his weakness and his misery as a way of inflicting misery on those around him. He orders Joseph and Hareton around the house in an atrocious manner. Nothing they ever do for him is good enough. But even though he's been pampered and he's had every material need taken care of, he feels that he's been granted the most miserable lot in life that there is. He's sick, he's weak, and he complains constantly. And his complaints, they verge from the humorous to the irritating and to the downright frustrating. We can see flashes of Heathcliff's personality in him, or at least Joseph can. He says as much. But what keeps him from being just as much of a bully as his father is his weak, sickly constitution. He's described in terms that make us think, I don't know, maybe of a defanged lion. If he had the strength, he would be just as violent as some of the other characters that we've encountered in this novel. And at one point, Heathcliff says this about him. He says, "Don't expect thanks for this noble devotion." He's speaking to Cathy here. He's saying, "I heard him, Linton, draw a pleasant picture to Zillah of what he would do if he were as strong as I. The inclination is there, and his very weakness will sharpen his wits to find a substitute for his strength." So this isn't a very flattering picture of a person, but the real flaw in his character, and almost I think the real tragedy, is his own acceptance of his bad personality and his unwillingness to change. At one point, Linton says this to Cathy. He says, "You are so much happier than I that you ought to be better. Papa talks enough of my defects and shows enough scorn of me to make it natural I should doubt myself. I doubt whether I am not altogether as worthless as he calls me, frequently. And then I feel so cross and bitter I hate everybody. I am worthless, and bad in temper, and bad in spirit almost always. And if you choose, you may say goodbye. You'll get rid of an annoyance. Only, Catherine, do me this justice. Believe that if I might be as sweet and as kind and as good as you are, I would be, and willingly, and more so than as happy and as healthy. And believe that your kindness has made me love you deeper than if I deserved your love. And though I couldn't and cannot help showing my nature to you, I regret it and repent it and shall regret and repent it till I die." So this is a very bleak, helpless view of the human condition. Linton knows that he doesn't amount to much, but he's accepted it as a part of who he is. And because he's accepted it, he doesn't have the strength of will to change it. Not even for Kathy, who supposedly he loves. All he does is complain and wish mournfully about the sort of person that he might have been. So, Linton and Kathy form this attachment, unbeknownst to Edgar and Nellie, for some time. And there's one other person that I want to talk about as well here, who is sort of peripherally involved in the story, and that's Hareton Earnshaw. We see in these chapters that Heathcliff has succeeded in degrading him into the position that he himself was put into by Hindley all those years ago. But Heathcliff, when he was being treated as an uneducated servant, had the ambition and the awareness to be resentful of his condition. Hareton, on the other hand, seems to be proud of who he is. Joseph has taught him to revel in his ignorance, to mock at good manners and at civility, and tied in with those, to mock at education too. In a way, he's the opposite of the sort of heroes we've been reading about in this class, or the anti-heroes, those who wish to set themselves above the common herd of humanity through the achievement of some great exploit. Hareton wants to be part of the herd, but now, for the first time in his life, Hareton finds that he does have a motive for improving his mind, and it's to impress Kathy. She laughs at him for his illiteracy. She treats him rather cruelly, actually, but we can perhaps rectify this fault with the other gentle, kind aspects of her character by remembering that Linton has instilled a sort of bias in her against Hareton. Linton mocks and laughs at Hareton as well, because he wants to show himself as superior to him in Kathy's eyes. So Kathy looks down on Hareton, and when he begins to make a few bumbling attempts at reading and writing, she scoffs at them. It's almost like she doesn't think that he's intelligent enough to have feelings that are capable of being hurt. And we might wonder what intelligence has to do with feelings and emotions. But remember, we've talked about this word before in this class, that sensibility was a 19th century virtue. The ability to feel deeply and be profoundly moved by scenes from life and from nature. Sensibility was also something that was thought to come about through cultivation and through learning. So from this view, it would make sense that if Hareton were uneducated, he would also be incapable of feeling deeply. We wouldn't agree with this, of course, ourselves, but it's probably what Kathy has come to believe through her own education. So we know now that Hareton has a fondness for Kathy, and that's going to be a key to understanding some of his violent outbursts and his embarrassed behavior later on in the story. Well, Heathcliff's plan is going pretty smoothly. He wants Linton to marry Kathy so that he can get control of Thrushcross Grange, and in turn sign the deed over to his father, to himself. The problem is that Linton's health starts to deteriorate, and he doesn't want to leave the fireside. So Heathcliff becomes tyrannical, ordering him out of the house to go on dates with Kathy. And Kathy and Nellie, they see that the boy would much rather not be there, but that he's been compelled to meet up with them. He's terrified of disobeying his father, not overly in love with Kathy. However, Edgar Linton's health is deteriorating at the same time, and there's some uncertainty as to which of the two of them is going to die first. And again, we might be surprised as modern-day readers that either of them are in such unstable conditions. Even Nellie says that there's no good reason to believe either of them won't live to old age. But this is a novel that, as a whole, reflects on sickness and on death, and it's reflective of the time and the area in which it was written. Several cholera pandemics spanned the length of the 19th century, and these were largely caused by unclean drinking water. Consumption, or tuberculosis, was also a serious threat. tuberculosis features largely in many 19th century novels, almost to the point where it became this sort of cliched theme. And again, you'll remember that the Bronte family suffered from a combination of these diseases. Their drinking water was contaminated by the runoff from a nearby cemetery, and this led to inflammation of the lungs and to tuberculosis. Within the space of a year, her brother Branwell died. Emily herself had died. And then their youngest sister, Anne, she died as well. So untimely deaths, a succession of them coming on one right after another, wouldn't have seemed strange to Emily as she was writing her novel. Heathcliff is unaware of Edgar's illness, however, and he's just worried that Linton will die before he can marry Cathy. And so he kidnaps Cathy. He won't let her go home to Edgar, who is on his deathbed, until she agrees to marry Linton. And this is something that, he probably wouldn't be able to get away with in other parts of the country, but he's taking full advantage of the isolation from the rest of society to behave more like a tyrant from the Dark Age than like a 19th century gentleman. Cathy eventually escapes at the price of marrying Linton and is reunited with her father right before his death. Edgar doesn't know what's going on, and he trusts that Linton is going to make a good husband to his daughter, and so Edgar dies happy. In fact, Nellie describes it as ecstatic, the way that he passes. And neither she or Cathy have told him about the dire straits that they've been in, about being kidnapped by Heathcliff and all that, because they know that it's just going to disturb his mind in his last minutes, and that it's not going to do any good anyway. So Edgar dies, and Heathcliff comes to take Cathy back to Wuthering Heights, where she'll live with Linton, and with Heathcliff too. And there's an interesting moment when he comes to claim Cathy. He makes a rather odd confession to Nellie. He tells her that on the evening of Edgar's funeral, since he was buried with Catherine, the Catherine he loved, not the Cathy that's currently alive, Heathcliff says that he bribed the undertaker to let him look into his Catherine's coffin. And this is morbid, but he says that when he looked in, she hasn't changed in all that time, that she hasn't started to decay. And we can question whether or not we should believe this, right? This might be his fevered imagination. Maybe he was so in love with her that she still gleamed before him like an idol, when really all that was there was a skeleton. In fact, in most film adaptations of Wuthering Heights, we see this interpretation being taken. We see Heathcliff beholding a glowing, beautiful Catherine in the coffin, and then the director lets us see the remains right afterwards. So the audience sees that he's hallucinating, but Heathcliff thinks he's seen a reality. But it's interesting from a supernatural perspective, because this isn't really, this isn't the first unnaturally preserved corpse we've read about in this class. When we think about Frankenstein and the monster that he creates, it's made out of body parts that still have vitality, still have life in them. And then later on, when we get to Dracula, another recently deceased character is going to have the same peculiarity of not looking decayed, of still looking fresh. Then Heathcliff confesses to Nellie that actually he had started to dig up Catherine's corpse years earlier, on the eve of her own funeral, but he was stopped at the last minute by Catherine's ghost. He says this: "I got a spade from the tool house and began to delve with all my might. It scraped the coffin. I fell to work with my hands. The wood commenced cracking about the screws. I was on the point of attaining my object when it seemed that I heard a sigh from someone above, close at the edge of the grave and bending down. 'If I can only get this off,' I muttered. 'I wish they may shovel in the earth over us both.' and I wrenched at it more desperately still. There was another sigh, close at my ear. I appeared to feel the warm breath of it displacing the sleet-laden wind. I knew no living thing in flesh and blood was by, but as certainly as you perceive the approach to some substantial body in the dark, though it cannot be discerned, so certainly I felt that Kathy was there, not under me, but on the earth. A sudden sense of relief flowed from my heart through every limb. I relinquished my labor of agony and turned consoled at once, unspeakably consoled. Her presence was with me. It remained while I refilled the grave and led me home. You may laugh if you will, but I was sure I should see her there. I was sure she was with me, and I could not help talking to her. Having reached the heights, I rushed eagerly to the door. It was fastened, and I remember that accursed Earnshaw and my wife opposed my entrance. I remember stopping to kick the breath out of him, and then hurrying upstairs to my room, and hers. I looked round impatiently. I felt her by me. I could almost see her, and yet I could not. I ought to have sweat blood then from the anguish of my yearning, from the fervor of my supplications to have but one glimpse. I had not one. She showed herself, as she often was in life, a devil to me. And since then, sometimes more and sometimes less, I've been the sport of that intolerable torture. Infernal, keeping my nerves at such a stretch that, if they had not resembled catgut, they would long ago have relaxed into the feebleness of Linton's. So this is all new information for us, the readers, because we didn't hear about any of that a couple chapters ago when all this was going on. But apparently, Heathcliff has been in this perpetual state of anticipation ever since. And we'll see that this condition grows in him when we read the concluding chapters of the novel next week. But an interesting reversal is happening here from what typically happens in a ghost story. The dead are not restless here. The living are. Heathcliff is being goaded about like an animal by this presence that he can't see. This hasn't stopped him from plotting his revenge, of course, but it's been enough to keep him in a state of unrest for nearly 20 years. So we'll talk about this more next time. So for then, finish up reading Wuthering Heights. Nellie's tale will end, and we'll go back to Lockwood's narrative and see how all of this comes to an end. Thanks.